Yeah, he's not really dead. The Dallas producers killed off Bobby Ewing at the end of the 8th season when Patrick Duffy left the show, only to bring him back over a year later when the actor decided to return. This made the entire 9th season of the series a dream sequence that took place solely in the mind of his character's wife. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes. While at a parlor enjoying some ice cream, the gang reads the news about the abduction of a driver and his car at a nearby Desert Grand Prix race. As the crime seems to involve the spirit of a racer who died in an accident several years earlier and now seems out for revenge, Fred and the rest decide to investigate matters themselves. That sure looks like chocolate sauce on top of chocolate ice cream. Worst dog owners ever. Instead of focusing on his job, driver Ken Rogers decided to become a bit of a gambler by selling stolen race cars overseas. Taking advantage of a local legend, he disguised himself as the Phantom Racer, a ghost driving a spectral race car specially modified to steal the other vehicles while in the middle of the Desert Grand Prix.
If I have to cancel this race, I'm afraid I'll be ruined.
Don't worry, Mr. Osborne.
We'll solve this mystery for you.
Is it me, or does it seem like every businessman or team owner in the Scooby-Doo universe is one single loss away from bankruptcy? These guys need to hire better money managers. It's tricky to ascertain just how valuable Roger's scheme would have been, as there's no easy way to determine the value of the vehicles he was trying to steal. For starters, it's difficult to even pinpoint the exact models of the race cars involved, as they seem to run the gamut of several available at the time this episode was produced. The first car stolen was reminiscent of a Lotus Ford 49, whereas the one Rogers drove while faking his own abduction was similar to a Lola T140 Highwing. Shaggy and Scooby's vehicle was just as hard to pin down, as were the rest seen in the race at the end of the episode. It's likely the animators simply pieced together the cars they drew from various reference photos available at the time. It's also possible that the Grand Prix sponsored by Mr. Osborne allowed for heavily modified vehicles, thus further making pricing these race cars that much more complicated. I can't even find reliably consistent figures for what race cars in general would have sold for in the late 1970s, and because automobile technology has evolved so much since then, it's not even fair to take what a modern race car would cost and adjust the price backward to account for inflation. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to estimate that each race car seen would be worth around $20,000 at the time, since this seemed to be a figure that popped up a lot when researching historical prices. This would equate to over $100,000 each in today's money. Even if these figures are way off, it doesn't matter in the end, since Rogers was planning on selling them illegally overseas. So that could either mean he'd ask for a lot less than they're worth because they were stolen merchandise, or a lot more since they were a rare product that a buyer would otherwise have a difficult time procuring. Indeed, the latter makes more sense because if you're wealthy enough to afford a race car and the team needed to drive and maintain the vehicle, you probably have enough money to buy one legitimately. Over the years, though, the United States has issued sanctions against various countries and banned trade with them, so perhaps Rogers had buyers in a foreign nation that couldn't legally obtain them. This would, of course, likely increase how much he could get for the stolen goods. We see a total of 6 cars in the final race, so assuming Rogers had been able to steal them and successfully offload them to his buyers at $20,000 each, that would earn him $120,000 total, or $640,000 in today's money. This is where I would usually chime in about how that's a decent amount of cash, but not enough to retire on. However, this design had a significant difference to the usual low-dollar Scooby villain scheme. Rogers' plan may have involved kidnapping, but he solved the dilemma of what to do with his victims by erasing their short-term memory of the abductions. This allowed him to steal their race cars, but not have to worry about what to do with the driver afterward. He wouldn't have to dispose of any potential witnesses or worry about them escaping captivity to expose his identity or hideout.
Zoink!
looks like we're too late.
Ken Rogers is trying to qualify right now.
And if Rogers is caught in the Valley of No Return, he's doomed.
Even better, by kidnapping himself, Rogers would be able to fake amnesia and avoid suspicion, as he would appear to be just another victim of the Phantom Racer. Instead of skipping the country or changing his identity to cover up his own disappearance, he would instead be able to continue living his life as he had, only $500,000 richer.
Rogers also rigged up the car like a lumber carrier, so he could pick up another car with magnets and carry it off to his secret cavern beneath the junkyard.
I really don't know where to draw the line when it comes to Hanna-Barbera and their disregard for physics or even simple scale. Throughout the episode, we see the Phantom Racer's car look roughly the same size as all the others on the track, including this top-down shot at the end. Yet in the flashback, it's shown to be twice the size of the vehicle it was stealing. Which of course it would have to be. It's odd that Velma is the one explaining this to us, because if it were the other way around and I was trying to explain this to her, as skeptical as she usually is, it would be unlikely that I could say she believes in me. Setting aside the usual Hanna-Barbera sloppiness, Rogers didn't have to go out of pocket for his scheme, as he was able to use parts salvaged from a junkyard, including the jet engine he used to make his spectral race car faster than the vehicles he was pursuing. Yes, there's no way he would have been able to fit a jet engine from a fighter plane into a race car as shown, but remember, I said we were setting aside the usual Hanna-Barbera sloppiness. It stands to reason Rogers also sourced the ghost vehicle from the same junkyard, as it was close to the track and would undoubtedly have contained any number of junked race cars. He probably even found the lumber carrier parts needed to create the mechanism for stealing the other drivers' cars. We have technically seen a stolen car ring before, but they were a run-of-the-mill criminal organization focusing on everyday vehicles and not the exotic and much more expensive race cars seen in this episode. So as far as I'm concerned, Rogers' plot was a first for the Scooby franchise. The Phantom Racer scheme was original, profitable, and provided everything went off without a hitch, low risk for Rogers himself. I'm giving him a 5 out of 5 for the design. It's tempting to compare the Phantom Racer with the Space Kook, yet I feel their differences are greater than their similarities. On a superficial level, they both have skull or skull-ish faces behind a helmet and are wearing blue suits. However, Space Kook's helmet glowed while performing his hellish banshee wail, while the Phantom Racer had no special effects tied directly to his costume. That's not to say Rogers didn't employ any special effects. Though never brought up in the episode, his spectral race car featured an eerie glow, and at one point Rogers used the standard Scooby villain movie projector to make it appear as though he had kidnapped himself. The Phantom Racer didn't fly or walk through walls, but that wasn't necessary for the most part, as his MO was making other race cars and drivers disappear. With his red eyes, ghastly white skin, yellow fanged teeth, and snake-like slits for a nose, the Phantom Racer was sufficiently scary enough that even without the other more traditional ghostly attributes, he should certainly frighten most observers, particularly as his hunting grounds were primarily a dark and foggy setting. Space Kook aside, if anyone is stealing someone else's look here, it's the producers of the Harry Potter films. There was one other disguise employed by Rogers, but it's so inconsequential that it's hardly worth mentioning.
Yoo-hoo! Anybody home?
Come on.
What are you young'uns doing here?
We're looking for the Phantom of the Grand Prix race, sir.
I've seen him lots of times. He's been haunting the old antique car museum on the hill.
Thank you, sir. And that's our next stop.
Oh great, another museum. I wonder if all the exhibits there will survive intact.
It's locked.
How are we gonna get in? Well, that wraps it up. Except for the old watchman at the junkyard.
That was also Rogers in disguise.
How did Mr. Osborne even know about the guy at the junkyard? And why would that have even been a mystery? It's not like the watchman disappeared or did anything suspicious. Even if Osborne had seen the man, wouldn't he just have assumed it was an employee of the junkyard? I do not understand why the writers added this bit. If the villain has more than one disguise in a Scooby episode, usually the unmasking involves the gang removing one mask after the other like a Russian nesting doll. Here the watchman played no significant role other than to direct Fred and the rest to the museum. If, from a narrative standpoint, it was felt necessary to provide an ancillary character to add to the suspect pool, a legitimate night watchman who had nothing to do with the villain scheme could have accomplished the same thing. I'm not going to fault Rogers for having the multiple disguises in this section, as we're focusing solely on the outfits themselves and their suitability. Rogers perfectly utilized the tragedy of the deceased race car driver from a few years earlier, and he was able to divert the gang's attention from the junkyard toward the museum. With his choices, Roger could say to himself that he had successfully decorated my life of crime. So he gets a 5 out of 5 for his outfit score. Before discussing how Rogers went about implementing his scheme, let's take a moment to appreciate another villain in this episode who somehow slipped under the radar. The Grand Prix organizer, Mr. Osborne.
Grand Prix driver went off a cliff in the fog many years ago. The legend is that his ghost prowls these roads in a phantom race car, seeking vengeance on all race drivers.
The entire premise of the Phantom Racer was based on the actual death of another driver who was killed after his car went over a cliff during foggy conditions. And what do we see in this episode? Time trials held at night on unlit track under extremely foggy conditions. Did Mr. Osborne learn nothing from the previous tragedy? Would they really hold the time trials under these conditions? Because who would want to watch? It would be different if this was on a well-lit speedway, but there are no lights to be seen anywhere the race cars are driving. At best, the audience should only be able to see a distant set of moving headlights, which sounds boring as hell. There wasn't even enough moonlight to race by, because not only was it foggy, but the very first shot of the episode established that the moon was behind dense cloud cover.
Conover's car 49 has disappeared. Zoinks! That's not the Phantom. It's the missing driver, Conover.
Let's examine this further. One of the drivers and his vehicle was abducted mid-race, and though he does return later, he was rather worse for wear. Despite there being no explanation for the driver's disappearance, Osborne still allowed the Grand Prix preparations to continue despite there being a known danger to the competitors. It should also be noted that at no point were any police officers seen at the track before the final unmasking, either to investigate Conover's disappearance or provide extra security going forward. This implies that either the authorities weren't contacted or they were told not to stick their noses into the situation. What's the explanation for that? I can only guess, but considering the desert location, it's conceivable that the Grand Prix was being held near Las Vegas. At the time, though their influence was waning, there was still a significant mob presence in that city. Was Osborne in debt to organized crime or otherwise following their orders to keep the race going no matter what? Going further, was Rogers himself merely a patsy for a local crime syndicate dabbling in stolen race cars? That would explain how easy it was for the Phantom Racer to get his gloves on something with such a surprisingly complicated method of stealing moving vehicles. This is all just a fun little theory of mine and won't have any bearing on Rogers' final score, but it would go a long way toward explaining away Osborne's actions. Otherwise, he's just a scumbag worried more about his bottom line than the safety of his drivers or even any innocent bystanders watching the race. It's been a while, but we finally have another demonstrably ruthless Scooby villain in Ken Rogers. To begin with, racing is already a dangerous sport, and drivers have been killed over the years from making simple mistakes traveling at high speed on well-lit tracks in ideal weather conditions. The Phantom Racer stole cars at night on dark roads in crippling fog by not only chasing the drivers down in an unnerving manner, but also landing his chassis on top of them. If at any time the driver under attack panicked or otherwise lost control, it could have easily resulted in a crash causing serious injury or death. And this wasn't the only time Rogers threatened the lives of innocent people.
Oh no!
Shaggy! Scooby!
In his guise as the junkyard watchman, Rogers directed the gang to the antique car museum where he attempted to kill Shaggy and Scooby by trapping them in an older vehicle and pushing it down a steep hill, presumably hoping the crash would kill them. Had he been successful, this would have constituted premeditated murder, since he had deliberately directed the teenagers to the spot where he intended to end their lives. I do have to ask, why didn't Shaggy and Scooby just open the door and jump out the other side? They were surprisingly cooperative for victims. Though being their usual cowards of the county, they might have simply been too scared to resist. I wonder if all the exhibits there will survive intact. Museums and the Scooby Gang. Like nitro and glycerin.
This race car Mr. Osborne loaned us will be perfect.
Right, Velma.
The race car in front of the gas pump is Roger's vehicle that was just stolen in the previous scene.
Here come Shag and Scooby.
Jeepers, they're really burning up the road.
It's good to know that when driving race cars later in the Scooby franchise, Shaggy is smart enough to wear a seatbelt.
The Phantom's right on their tail. Come on, our decoy worked.
I just hope our decoys don't turn out to be dead ducks.
Why would Rogers have gone after Shaggy and Scooby? Wouldn't he have smelled a trap? As one of the Grand Prix drivers, he should have known which cars were officially part of the race.
Zoinks! I'm giving her all she's got, Scoob! Do something, Scooby!
Poor Shaggy. It really sucks to be abandoned by a friend, especially when there's danger. You picked a fine time to leave him, Scooby.
Just my luck. A Phantom who's an expert bricklayer.
You've caused trouble for the last time.
More attempted murder, and a very cruel way to do it. Granted, Shaggy wasn't in any real danger, as it would take at least 24 hours for the mortar to dry. All he had to do to escape was wait until the Phantom Racer left and give the brick wall a gentle push. There's a reason Montresor used chains on his victim first.
Hey, this is strange. A book on magic tricks.
And how to hypnotize.
I wonder what kind of magic tricks our Phantom is up to.
While searching for Shaggy, Fred and Daphne discovered a book on magic tricks and another on hypnosis. While these do look suspiciously like methods the Phantom Racer could use to enact his scheme, this was the 1970s, and it's possible those books were simply being used by a sleazy guy wanting to pick up women. I'm not kidding. There were a lot of books like this back then.
Then he'd hypnotize the drivers so they would blank out and never remember what happened. Yeah.
Rogers did incapacitate the drivers with hypnosis instead of a physical attack or drugs. So instead of this sex pest, he was more like this sex pest. Wait a minute. If Rogers could hypnotize his victims to forget what happened, why didn't he do that with Shaggy instead of walling him up inside an alcove? As we've seen before, the teenager was easily susceptible to hypnosis. Was this revenge for Shaggy escaping his earlier death trap? Or just further evidence as to how bloodthirsty Rogers was? Considering how recklessly he abducted his victims and stole their race cars, as well as how easily he resorted to killing nosy intruders, I can't help but wonder if perhaps Rogers was responsible for the death of the driver who originally inspired the Phantom Racer story. It certainly couldn't be ruled out considering all we saw in the episode. Why did Rogers steal the cars the way he did? Why not just break into the garage at night and load them all onto a trailer and take them to his junkyard hideout? He could have had them all at once and not bother with the hassle of the Phantom Racer scheme. There would have been no need for the disguise, the modified car, the second identity of the watchman, etc. Considering the lack of security seen at the track, it's not like there wasn't an excellent chance of him succeeding this way. Stealing all the race cars at once would also solve an extremely obvious flaw in Rogers' scheme. At some point, he would have stolen enough vehicles that Osborne would have been forced to cancel the race regardless of how determined he was to run it. The Grand Prix only had 6 competitors in the first place, which already meant it couldn't have been that much of a draw. After 3 or 4 more strikes from the Phantom Racer, who would want to be in an audience to see just 2 cars compete against each other? Then again, considering how desperate Osborne seemed to be, it wouldn't be surprising if he still ran the Grand Prix, even if he had to drive his own car in the race.
But how did he make himself disappear?
Simple. That wasn't a phantom we saw chasing Rogers. It was a projected image from a projector in his car.
Rogers' method was effective in deflecting suspicion away from himself. Staging his own abduction not only gave him a good alibi, but, as mentioned earlier, it would have allowed him to keep his own identity after his crime. I can't stress that last point enough, considering how many Scooby villains don't seem to consider the ramifications of their schemes if they were successful in implementing them. It was also smart of Rogers to have staged his kidnapping so early on, allowing him the ability to spend more time in his Phantom Racer identity as he went about his plot. This way, he wouldn't have to continually swap in and out of disguise when it was necessary to appear as himself.
Tire tracks, and only race cars have tires that wide.
Jeepers, look! That's strange. The inside tracks just disappear. Look, more tire tracks. But this time there's a difference. Roger's car left tracks, but the Phantom's car didn't.
The only real mistake Rogers made was not doing a better job of accounting for the tracks his spectral race car left when kidnapping his victims, or how suspicious it would appear for only his race car's tracks to be left behind after his own abduction. These tracks would lead the gang directly to the junkyard where he kept his stolen vehicles.
This time you're not chickening out on us, right, Scoob?
When have Shaggy or Scooby ever been allowed to chicken out of any spooky situation? At best, they're allowed to choose whatever they feel is the least scary areas of wherever the gang are investigating. Worst friends ever.
The tracks leave the road.
Let's see where they go. You lead, Scoob.
Oh, me?
Well, if the Phantom's around, your keen nose will sniff him out.
See? They do acknowledge that Scooby has a better sense of smell than a human. He absolutely should be able to tell who's inside the costume if he met the villain even once while not in disguise. There is something that bothers me about these tracks, though.
Look!
Wow, these tracks just disappear like the others.
The tracks end abruptly there. But how? The gang find the Phantom Racer's vehicle in his underground hideout, but how could it have driven there without leaving any tracks? This would have made sense if they had ended at a cave entrance, garage door, or some other entry to the hidden area, but they just stopped at the entrance to the junkyard. If Rogers had used a large magnet to pick up his vehicle and place it in the hideout, that would have been an easy explanation for the disappearing tracks, but we never see one of those. There should have been tire marks all the way to where the spectral race car was parked.
Look, more tire tracks. But this time there's a difference. Roger's car left tracks, but the Phantom's car didn't.
These abruptly disappearing tracks make even less sense. This was Roger's race car disappearing in the desert far from the junkyard. How did his vehicle manage to make it to the hideout without leaving any evidence? This is a major plot hole that never gets explained. Rogers gets high marks for being able to successfully steal a couple of the race cars, as well as catching and releasing his victim with no memory of the abduction. He also showed strong motivation for his crimes by sacrificing the safety of others, as well as 2 direct attempts at murder. His only real mistake was leaving tracks to his hideout, which, to be fair, would be difficult for anyone to cover up, considering he was stealing race cars. It might have been better for him to have stolen all the vehicles at once by loading them onto a trailer, but hiding something of that size might have been tricky at the junkyard, and being a kidnapped driver himself did allow for the ability to avoid suspicion. Ken Rogers gets a 4.5 out of 5 for the operation. He did his absolute best to avoid the long arm of the law.
This is it, race fans. The start of the Grand Prix.
Start of the Grand Prix? But the sign says it's still just the time trials.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
That's Rogers' car, number 78, in the race. Presumably, his team found another driver after he was arrested. The Phantom Racer gets a very impressive final due score, a 4.8 out of 5.
No more Phantom.
Yikes!
Phantom Bone!
Phantom Bone? Scooby-Doo!
What the f***? This is the second time in the franchise that Scooby eats a ghost bone that appeared out of nowhere.
Nice try, Scoob.
Come on.
This episode featured the same odd production mistake several times, wherein the action on the screen is duplicated within a smaller circle in the center. It's hard to see when there's movement in front of it, but once a character walks off camera, it's obvious once you know about it. These only seem to occur during the outdoor fog scenes, so I wonder if this was due to a plate or cell used for the fog effect, creating a reflection that was picked up by the camera. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon member and apologize in advance if I mispronounce the name. James Davis. Thank you, James Davis. I'll refrain from making any Garfield jokes. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. While heading toward a rafting vacation in the Ozarks, the Mystery Machine inexplicably suffers 4 flat tires. The gang look for shelter for the night and meet a family who recently moved to the area. Unfortunately for all involved, an evil witch seeks revenge and is determined to turn them all into frogs.
Frogs?
Just think of all the fun we'll have floating down the river on our rafts tomorrow.
You know who once thought it would be fun rafting down a secluded backwoods river? Ned Beatty.
Velma's right. We're on vacation, remember?
Vacation from what? None of them have jobs, and we've never seen them attend classes.
Sounds like we have a flat tire.
You mean 4 flat tires?
On the plus side, I bet Scooby could now blow a mean trumpet.
Forget the tires. We better find a place to spend the night.
Look! An old cabin, and it looks like somebody's there.
I'll never understand how casual the Scooby Gang are when it comes to finding accommodations. This may be a holdover from the 1960s when hippies always found a place to crash, but can you imagine driving cross-country every day until bedtime and then just looking around for a random stranger to ask if they'd let you sleep at their house for the night? This episode's premise relies on the famous feud between 2 Appalachian families, the Hatfields and the McCoys. Their squabble has been the basis for any number of books, film, and television over the years, despite the animosity between the 2 clans having been settled decades earlier. Incidentally, this episode takes place somewhere in the Ozarks, which is mostly in Missouri, while the actual Hatfield and McCoy families lived in Kentucky and West Virginia, about 700 miles away. It's possible that a member of the McCoy family had moved out of Appalachia to the Ozarks years before, then a family of Hatfields happened to do likewise, and coincidentally chose the exact same cabin. Or the Scooby writers just assumed every hillbilly lives in the same neck of the woods. Aggie Wilkins, the owner of the local general store, wanted to get her hands on a $500,000 stolen from a bank by her ex-boyfriend, Zeke Harkins. Though caught and imprisoned for his crime, Zeke managed to bury the loot somewhere in the woods near the old McCoy cabin and left behind cryptic clues to the location inside the ramshackle house. Somehow Aggie learned of this, but by that point, the Hatfield family had settled inside. Using the old feud as a pretext for her rampage, she disguised herself as the ghost of Witch McCoy, the spirit of a woman hanged for witchcraft over 100 years earlier, and threatened to turn the Hatfields into frogs if they didn't leave the area.
Frogs?
Zeke, meanwhile, and looking very much like a zombie himself, had escaped prison and returned to retrieve the fortune he had buried. Unfortunately for him, he had apparently forgotten the exact location and needed the clues from the cabin as well. Wait a minute. Two crooks dressed up as a witch and a zombie to scare others away so they could recover stolen bank money, but couldn't remember where in the rural setting it was hidden. And they used frogs as part of their cover story.
Frogs?
Why does that sound familiar? This is one of the more shamefully recycled Scooby plots I've seen so far, as it's mostly a retelling of Which Witch is Which from the first season of Where Are You? They even copied the part near the end where both Scooby and the villain are captured together due to a bending tree branch. Setting aside the lack of originality for the moment, the scheme itself was valuable as it was specifically stated that Zeke had stolen $500,000, which in today's money would be well over $2.5 million. And that's it for the plan's positives. Aggie's design relied heavily on convincing others she was a witch to scare them off, and when they didn't, to kidnap them to make others believe her victims had been turned into frogs.
Frogs?
Unless she was planning on murdering all witnesses, it would be just a matter of time until one or all escaped the sawmill where she kept them and summoned the police. That's assuming the police weren't already swarming the area. Zeke had broken out of prison, and as Dr. Richard Kimball could attest, the authorities spent more than a little bit of time and effort looking for those who escaped custody. One of the first places they would focus on would be wherever the convict had friends or family, let alone the location where it was likely he had stashed any unrecovered loot. It would have been smarter had Aggie simply waited until she saw Zeke in the area, then phoned the U.S. Marshals to claim the reward for his capture. It may not have been $500,000, but it would also have been safer for her own liberty. Of course, it's also possible that as his ex-girlfriend, Aggie may have been involved in the bank robbery from the beginning, but Zeke had taken the fall to protect her, which would make turning him in a risky proposition. In fact, it's for this reason that I lumped the two of them together under the same plot, as opposed to two villains operating independently, like how I separated the Headless Spectre from Asa Shanks in Haunted House Hang-Up. Unoriginal and unlikely to succeed, The Ghost of Witch McCoy and the Ozark Zombie get a 1.5 out of 5 for their design. $500,000 was barely enough to buy that half point. There's not much that can be said about Aggie Wilkins' witch costume. It's just a rubber mask, robes, and a shawl. She was supposed to be a ghost, but, as usual, featured no special effects like glowing, transparency, or flying.
Spider Mountain? Where's that?
It's a fur piece back in the woods. We-uns don't go near there 'cause it's so spooky.
It took me a while to figure out, but Ma Hatfield is saying a fur piece back in the woods. Growing up in the rural Midwest, I'm not exactly a city slicker, but I've never heard the expression a fur piece before. Apparently it means a long distance away, though the gang eventually managed to walk to Spider Mountain pretty quickly.
Who's in here? If I find any intruders in my cave, I'll turn them into toads.
Aggie Wilkins is clearly bluffing here. She's not really a witch who can turn people into frogs, and she doesn't exactly have a boxer's physique, so it's unlikely she could overpower many intruders. This is like a scared person at home at night who hears a noise and says, "Who's there?" in a brave voice, hoping to scare off trespassers.
Those old clothes give me an idea. I am a witch like you. What did you expect? A ghost from the coast? A spirit from Spokane? A zombie from Bombay?
Why didn't Velma just dress up as a witch herself? Why did she feel the need to disguise Scooby and go through the hassle of throwing her voice? I'll tell you why. Because she knows Scooby likes cross-dressing. The fact that the Ghost of Witch McCoy had a cave hideout filled with items that were being actively used, like open books and a bubbling cauldron, Not to mention how Scooby was able to slap a frog puppet over her head, proved she had a corporeal body. Her face was, I suppose, kind of scary. But apart from the dark green sclera, she was just an old crone. My late grandmother was about as frightening. Aggie was able to somehow convince people she was able to transform into a cat, but at no point in the episode is this ever explained.
Jeepers! The witch! Leave this cabin before you're all doomed!
Wow, she disappeared.
How did she do this? And you'll notice she merely disappeared this time and did not transform into a cat, which was her established MO by this point. At least in the older episode, the producers took the time to explain how the witch in that one managed to make people disappear. Aggie did utilize smoke effects to hide however she performed her transformations and disappearances, but it would have been nice if the writers hadn't been too lazy to explain the hard part of the magic trick. It's not like they didn't have a ready explanation handy, as later they established that the old McCoy cabin was rigged with trapdoors and secret panels. As for Zeke Harkins and his zombie disguise...
There they are, Sheriff.
Why, I know him. He's Zeke Harkins, the bank robber who just broke out of state prison.
He wasn't wearing a zombie disguise. Apparently, he was just... ugly. Not only was the poor guy bald, but he seemed to be suffering from some major pink eye. Probably should have washed his hands after digging in the mud. A lackluster ghost disguise, and no disguise, few special effects, and little for their victims to be afraid of, earns the two villains an outfit score of 1.5 out of 5. Aggie and Zeke's shenanigans were fraught with issues, with the worst being that instead of cooperating with each other, both acted on their own to cheat the other out of the loot. Had they pooled their efforts, instead of going through the whole Witch McCoy scheme, the two of them could have simply broken into the Hatfields' home, tied everyone up, found the clues, and recovered the stolen money. There may have been 4 family members and their dog versus the 2 bank robbers, but if Aggie was somehow able to subdue Pa Hatfield by herself when dressed as the witch, and the other 4 later when she turned them into frogs...
Frogs?
I find it hard to believe that working together, she and Zeke couldn't have easily taken care of the witnesses. They didn't even have to stick together afterward and could have simply split the loot before going their separate ways. Where did all these beds come from? The Hatfields' cabin is small, and they said they just moved into the area a year ago, which would imply they're probably not expecting so many overnight guests that they'd need that many spare beds. Also, lucky Velma.
Oh!
That's Ma Hatfield. Come on.
Pa's gone.
It's great that Pa Hatfield was turned into a frog because the gang just barged into the private bedroom he shares with his wife.
Oh!
That noise she made didn't have to be a shout of fear, if you know what I'm saying.
We'll search those woods over there, and you two can go into town and phone the sheriff.
Oh my God! Fred wants to call in the sheriff already. That's more rare than a talking dog.
Oh boy, what a creepy town. No wonder they call it Spooky Hollow.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. If they were this close to town that Shaggy and Scooby could reach it so quickly, why didn't all the gang walk to town when the Mystery Machine first got those flat tires? At least Spooky Hollow might have had a hotel they could stay in, rather than a random stranger's house.
Like we better find that phone.
It's the return of that weird production mistake with the mirrored action inside a circle. There's no fog effect this time, so that must not be what's going on.
Like hell! Open up! It's no use, Scoob. There's nobody here.
Gosh, whatever will they do to gain entry? At least this time they can claim it's an emergency and they needed to use the phone. Of course, I'm sure we can count on Shaggy and Scooby not to steal any food while they're in there, right?
What are you doing in my store?
You see, Witch McCoy turned poor old Pa Hatfield into a frog. Right, Pa?
Ready?
And then she turned herself into a cat.
No, she didn't.
You best stay away from anything to do with Witch McCoy and her cave up on Spider Mountain. It's been said that anyone that's dared to go up there has never been seen alive again.
Why would Aggie tell Shaggy and Scooby about the cave? She just gave away the location of her hideout.
And then Aggie Wilkins warned us to have nothing to do with Witch McCoy or her cave up at Spider Mountain.
At no point did Aggie Wilkins introduce herself to Shaggy or Scooby, and the sign on the store didn't have her name. How did he know she was called Aggie Wilkins?
Hey, look at this. Strange-looking marks gouged in the trail.
It could be a clue.
I'll take a picture of the marks and maybe we'll figure it out later.
That's not an instant camera, so it's somewhat inconvenient for snapping photos of evidence, especially for a group that doesn't usually stay in any location long enough to wait for the usual 24-hour turnaround time for film development. This was, after all, some time before 1-hour photo locations were everywhere. Also, where did the camera even come from? Daphne doesn't carry a purse. I guess Shaggy and Scooby aren't the only ones with access to the pocket dimension.
Well, here's the picture I took of those gouges on the trail.
What happened to the 4 flat tires?
But it still doesn't make any sense. I've got an idea. It's Morse code.
3 dots and 2 dashes, SM and sawdust. That's it!
The Mystery Machine apparently has a fully equipped darkroom. I'm old enough to have taken photography in high school where I had to develop my own film negatives as well as the final photos themselves. It's a cumbersome process, and the chemicals involved don't last indefinitely. Why didn't Hanna-Barbera just give the gang an instant camera? They were all the rage in the late 1970s.
It's the witch!
And she's up to no good.
She turned all the Hatfields into frogs. All we have to do is capture the witch and the zombie man and wrap it up by changing some of this writing.
Now let's see if she takes the bait.
So far, so good.
After she got rid of the Hatfields, why didn't Aggie get the directions to the stolen money right then and there? She had the clues to the secret panel already. If she had done this, she'd have been able to get the money before the gang or Zeke uncovered the hidden message.
What's a mound of sawdust doing here?
I don't know, but I'll bet it's a clue. We found these Morse code letters, SM, gouged out on the trail by the Hatfields as a clue after they were taken off.
And this sawdust was in the cabin.
That is a ridiculous amount of sawdust for Aggie to have inadvertently left behind after abducting the family. Sawdust has been a clue in the franchise before, specifically in the Snow Ghost episode, but that was just a small amount contained in the villain's tracks because he had been wandering the local sawmill. There's no way Aggie would have purposely left that much behind when she abducted the Hatfields. So is it possible that Zeke did it to foil her scheme with sabotage?
Sabotage? How? When?
It's also never explained how she was able to overpower any of the Hatfield family despite being a woman of small to average build. She had to have had a gun or other weapon to force her kidnapping victims away under threat of violence. Being a Saturday morning TV show, the producers probably felt it was better not to show that aspect of the villain's operation, though they didn't shy away from displaying other blatant acts of attempted violence.
Look, we can cross on that log. Keep going, we're halfway across. Yikes!
This attempt to murder Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby is the only direct action taken by Zeke in the entire episode to protect his scheme, regardless of having an opportunity earlier to get rid of some of the nosy teenagers.
Can't see what he's doing. Yikes! Hurry, he's getting away!
When Daphne surprised him while he was digging for his loot, despite having a very convenient weapon in his hands that would easily dispatch her, Zeke ran away instead. He may have felt it would have been more difficult to kill 3 teenagers with a pickaxe, especially when the stronger of the group wouldn't be the first to go down. So he performed a tactical retreat, whereas later he could murder 3 at once with a single push of a log.
You'll never escape!
Zoinks!
I'm going to cook up a lizard and frog stew, and you'll be the frogs!
Though she managed to trap them in a net, again, Aggie's not a real witch, and it's obvious she's still bluffing, because come on. Was she really going to cook Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby in that pot? I expect she left them alone, knowing they'd escape, and hopefully be too afraid to come back.
We got away! Yo!
I had been wondering how they were going to leave Spider Mountain since they originally had to cross a very deep chasm using a log bridge that was no longer there. Apparently, they could just jump across. So why did they bother with the log bridge in the first place?
I'm getting out of here. I'll get him. I told you I'd get him.
When did Scooby become so brave? And why wouldn't Zeke put up a harder struggle? He broke out of prison. You'd think 4 teenagers and a dog wouldn't be enough to stop him. Remember, he did try killing Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby, so he wasn't averse to violence.
Here's the money, Sheriff, buried right where the map said.
I won't bore you with the math. But I did confirm that $500,000 in $100 bills would fit in a briefcase that size.
But what happened to all the Hatfields?
SM means the sawmill, and that's where you'll find she locked up the Hatfields after she pretended to turn them into these frogs.
Frogs?
Gee, that's so thoughtful of the gang to call the sheriff, but leave the Hatfields locked up in the sawmill where they're probably cold, scared, and confused. This entire undertaking by Aggie and Zeke was filled with mistakes, bad ideas, and unnecessary actions. The only thing the 2 of them succeeded at was the original bank robbery itself, and even that ended up with Zeke getting captured and locked in prison. As usual, though, I'm giving them credit for their determination. I mean attempted murder. So they get an operation score of 2 out of 5. This leaves the Ghost of Witch McCoy and the Ozark Zombie with a final due score of 1.7 out of 5.
Like nothing's left but a skeleton.
Skeleton?
What in the hemorrhaging f***? This is the 2nd episode in a row to end with haunted bones. And that's my ranking of the villains from the 3rd set of episodes of the 2nd season of the Scooby-Doo Show, shown here along with the ones from my previous videos. At least one of the villains showed a marked increase in quality compared to the 2 episodes that immediately preceded, but unfortunately, it dipped right back down. It's so unfortunate that Hanna-Barbera reused the same plot lines so often in the early days of the Scooby franchise, considering how well they've maintained originality in later series. Hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. Jesus Christ, it's a f***ing haunted bone! Jesus Christ!